The morning they smiled while I lost my job started like every other ordinary workday, and that was the most dangerous part of it, because nothing about that day felt like a warning. I woke up before my alarm, the city still dark outside my apartment window, the kind of quiet that only exists before responsibility wakes up. I showered, dressed in the same neutral colors I always wore to blend in, drank coffee that tasted like nothing, and rehearsed the meeting I was supposed to lead at 10. I had no idea that by 9:30 my access badge would stop working, my email would be frozen, and people who had praised my integrity the week before would suddenly avoid eye contact. When I arrived at the office, security nodded at me the same way they always did. The lobby screens flashed quarterly numbers I had personally verified the night before. Everything looked normal, which is why the smile on my manager's face when he called me into the glass conference room felt so wrong. It wasn't nervous, it wasn't apologetic, it was relieved. He didn't ask me to sit. HR was already there, folders open, hands folded like this was a ceremony they had rehearsed. He said the words quickly, like ripping off a bandage: restructuring, performance alignment, difficult decision, effective immediately. I listened without interrupting because somewhere deep inside me I already knew this wasn't about my performance. It was about silence. They told me I would receive severance if I signed the document in front of me. They told me I should be grateful for the opportunity I'd had. They told me not to contact clients. And then, almost casually, my manager smiled and said, "You understand this is nothing personal." That was the moment I realized they thought they had won. I nodded because I understood something they didn't. The only reason they were smiling was because they believed I was powerless. As I stood up, security appeared, polite but firm, as if I were a risk rather than the person who had protected their numbers for years. People at nearby desks pretended to focus on their screens. A few watched, some smiled too, the tight kind that says relief it wasn't them. When the elevator doors closed, I saw my reflection for the first time that morning. I didn't look defeated. I looked calm. That scared me more than panic would have, because calm meant clarity. Outside, the air was sharp, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I sat in my car and stared at the building that had taken more of my life than I wanted to admit. That was when my phone buzzed, not a message of sympathy, not a check-in. It was an automated alert from a secure repository I had built months earlier, when I hoped I'd never need. "Access attempt detected," it read. Someone inside the company was opening files that only I knew how to compile properly. Files that explained discrepancies no one else wanted to explain. Files tied to a series of approvals that looked routine on the surface but hid something much larger underneath. That smile in the conference room replayed in my mind, and suddenly it made sense. They hadn't fired me because I was useless. They fired me because I was dangerous. I drove home slowly, not because I was sad, but because I needed time to think. For years, I had been the person who asked uncomfortable questions quietly, who double-checked numbers that everyone else accepted, who documented decisions instead of trusting verbal assurances. I had been taught that loyalty meant not embarrassing the people above you. Somewhere along the way, I learned that integrity meant something very different. 3 months earlier, I had been asked to sign off on a routine approval tied to an overseas licensing structure. It was supposed to be simple. It was. The ownership trail didn't align. The royalties didn't flow where they should have, and the signatures approving it came from people who didn't usually touch that level of detail. When I raised it internally, I was told not to overthink it. When I asked again, I was told it was above my pay grade. That was when I started documenting everything, quietly, carefully, knowing that if I was wrong, I would look paranoid, but if I was right, someone would eventually try to erase me. By the time I reached my apartment, I already knew what they were doing inside that building. They were scrambling. They were trying to reroute access, adjust narratives, and prepare an internal explanation that painted me as disgruntled. What they didn't know was that the signature they were relying on to hold everything together was the same signature that tied them to a $7.4 billion licensing structure spread across shell entities. Deferred royalty streams, and a compliance loophole that only worked as long as no one looked too closely. I hadn't just noticed it, I had traced it. I had documented every approval, every timestamp, every internal message that said, "Let's move fast" instead of "Let's do this right." That afternoon, while they were celebrating my exit, I received a call from a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly. It was someone who had left the company a year earlier under mutual agreement, someone who had warned me quietly to protect myself if I kept digging. I didn't tell them I had been fired. I didn't need to, they already knew. They asked one question: did they make you sign? When I said no, there was a pause, and then they said, good. Because what you have matters more than you think. That was the first time anyone had acknowledged the weight of what I was carrying, not as revenge, not as leverage, as responsibility. That night I didn't sleep. I reviewed everything again, not out of fear, but out of respect for the truth. I followed the money, the approvals, the silence. I realized this wasn't just about my company. The structure touched partners, regulators, and institutions that prided themselves on compliance while benefiting from ambiguity. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system, and systems don't collapse because of anger. They collapse because of precision. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I understood why they smiled when I lost my job. They believed the story ended there. They believed I would disappear quietly, sign the papers, and move on. They didn't know that the signature they trusted most was the one that would eventually expose everything. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them the way they expected. I wasn't going to post, rage, or threaten. I was going to let the truth move at the speed it always does when it's documented properly, slow at first, then all at once. I sent one email from my personal account, not to the press, not to social media, but to a compliance address that couldn't ignore what I attached. No commentary, no emotion, just facts, clear. Verifiable, irrefutable. When I hit send, I felt something shift, not victory, alignment, the kind that comes when you stop trying to survive and start standing still. They were still smiling when they locked my badge. They were still smiling when they escorted me out, but that smile was built on the belief that power lives in offices and titles. By the time the day ended, that belief was already cracking. They just didn't know it yet. By the time the sun rose fully over the city, the story had already slipped out of their control, even though no headlines existed yet and no alarms had been triggered inside the building. That is how real consequences begin, quietly, while people who believe they are powerful are still convincing themselves everything is contained. I made breakfast out of habit, not hunger, and sat at my small kitchen table scrolling through nothing in particular, waiting for the inevitable reaction. It didn't come immediately. Instead, there was silence, the dangerous kind, the kind that tells you someone is reading very carefully. Around 11, my phone rang again, different number, restricted. I let it ring twice before answering. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself, which told me everything. It asked one question, slow and deliberate: where did you obtain this documentation? I answered truthfully and briefly. There was another pause, longer this time, and then the line went dead. What they didn't realize was that I had already expected this call. The documentation wasn't stolen, it wasn't leaked. It was generated as part of my role, stored using approved systems, and backed up legally the moment I realized I might be removed. They had assumed silence meant compliance. They had assumed professionalism meant obedience. That assumption was the crack everything would eventually fall through. By mid-afternoon, I received confirmation that an external review had been initiated, not by the company, but by a third party with no interest in protecting reputations. That was when the internal panic truly began. Former colleagues started texting vague questions. One asked if I was okay, another asked if I had heard anything strange. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because the moment you speak too early, you give people something to twist. The next day, my former manager's name appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, clarification. I didn't open it, I already knew what it would say. It would frame my concerns as misunderstandings, my documentation as misinterpretation, and my silence as hostility. Instead, I forwarded it unopened to the same compliance thread. That was the moment the tone changed. The third day, an official letter arrived requesting my cooperation in a formal inquiry, not an interview, not a conversation, an inquiry. They weren't smiling anymore. Inside the company, meetings were being rescheduled without explanation. Executives who never spoke directly to analysts were suddenly checking in. Entire teams were locked out of systems under the excuse of upgrades. And somewhere behind closed doors, someone realized that the signature they had relied on to keep everything stitched together was the same one that tied every decision back to the top. By the end of the week, the number everyone was whispering had finally been calculated properly. Not millions, billions. The licensing structure they thought was clever had compounded over years, creating obligations that no longer matched reported revenue. the exposure wasn't theoretical. It was real, documented, and impossible to unwind without admitting what had been done. The board called an emergency session. External advisors were brought in. Legal teams stopped asking how to fix it and started asking how to survive it. And still, no one contacted me directly. They were afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of creating another record. Afraid of acknowledging that the person they had escorted out with security now held the cleanest version of the truth. When the first article finally appeared, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't name names, it simply stated that a $4.8 billion royalty structure was under review following irregular approvals and internal compliance failures. That was enough. Markets don't wait for explanations, partners don't wait for apologies. Trust evaporates faster than it's built, and once it's gone, no amount of smiling fixes it. I watched the coverage from my couch, not with satisfaction but with a strange sense of distance. This wasn't revenge, this was inevitability. They had built something fragile and called it success. All I had done was stop pretending it was solid. A week later, I was asked to provide sworn testimony. I did, calmly, clearly, with documentation that spoke louder than I ever could. The narrative they had tried to create about me unraveled immediately when timelines didn't match their accusations. The idea that I was disgruntled collapsed when emails showed I had raised concerns professionally for months. The story they wanted to tell about a rogue employee couldn't survive the reality of systemic approval. By the time the inquiry concluded its first phase, multiple executives had been placed on leave. Others resigned quietly. The smile I remembered from that conference room felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I didn't return to that office. I didn't need to. A different call came instead, one that started with, "We'd like to discuss your next steps." Not an offer, a question. Because power shifts when people realize who actually understands the system they've been abusing, I declined most of what was proposed. Not because it wasn't tempting, but because I had learned something valuable. The moment you let fear dictate your silence, you give away more than a job, you give away yourself. The day the final figure was confirmed publicly, the number dominated every internal conversation I was no longer part of. $4.8 billion, $1 signature, one approval trail. One truth no one wanted to see until it was too large to hide. They had thought I was powerless because I didn't raise my voice. They had mistaken quiet for weakness and compliance for loyalty. What they never understood was that power doesn't announce itself, it documents, it waits, and then it speaks once clearly when it matters most.